I'm doing a response video to Bart Kay this time. I'm going to be looking at a video entitled, what is it? Coach Kait and Myself, in which Kait asks Bart where the association between heart disease and diet came about, or dietary fat, how that began. And Bart launches into criticizing Ancel Keys right away, as has many other internet diet gurus, particularly the high-fat diet gurus or the low-carb diet gurus, that find Ancel Keys very threatening, and for good reason. But it wasn't Ancel Keys that originally proposed that diet had an association with heart disease and that dietary fat had an association with heart disease. It's just that Ancel Keys actually put together the first study of it on that topic, and he was the first one to put together the multinational epidemiological study. And so people who don't like epidemiology, again, they tend to be the same people that rail against Ancel Keys and plant-based diets in general. I mean, most of the epidemiological research does support plant-based diets, so this is not something that sits well with the anti-vegans, and so here we are. Bart, that is, goes on to criticize Ancel Keys, as has many other internet diet gurus in this echo chamber that includes, if you go back to Denise Minger, Rob Wolf, Andrew Weil, W-E-I-L, Chris Masterjohn, Chris Kresser, Eric Berg, Gary Taubes. There's Robert Lustig as well. Robert Lustig, and I think Gary Taubes, and Mark Sisson, maybe, yeah, Mark Sisson, and some others. They've written books, popular press books, against Ancel Keys, speaking out against Ancel Keys, with just blatant inaccuracies too. So I'd be ashamed, but they go on, and a lot of other bro scientists are in this camp too. So let's look at what it is that there's a lot of myths that surround the Ancel Keys and his famous 7-country study. A lot of the problem is because the 7-country study is often confused with the 6-country study and the 22-country study, and all three of them are different. So let's go through and sort out some of the confusion. And what I'll do is I'll just play the video, at least just a clip of the video, about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes of the video, and then I'll give my commentary after that. But another wanted to mention that Wikipedia, you can see it. It's almost, if you go to the original, I'll show a couple of the original papers that you can get online in which Ancel Keys wrote, and Yerushalmi and Hilleboat as well. Those are the authors of the 22-country study, a separate study from the 7-country study using separate data, but we'll go into that. But if you look at their original papers from 1953, 1957, and then you look at the actual, there's a 7-country study link you can go to. Here it is here. And you just click on that, and look, it's an ongoing study. It's a prospective study, so there was no cherry picking of the results as the high-fat diet gurus will claim. But it was a prospective study, a longitudinal study, and they used their own data. They didn't use national statistics on mortality and diet. They gathered their own data for that. So there was no cherry picking involved, and that's the most common complaint. But go to the 7-country study. Don't take my word for it. Don't take Bart's or any of the other gurus, or maybe do listen to a little bit of them, but then listen to the other side, and then go to the actual sites yourself and make your own decision. Most people that are criticizing Ancel Keys obviously haven't looked at the original papers and or some of the peer-reviewed studies on it. Here's one now. you know, one of these sources by itself wouldn't be enough, although this particular study by Pett as well as others is pretty revelatory. It's only a couple pages long, really, and it's based, at least it's referencing a lot of primary sources in this, and every paragraph has a truth bomb in it. Well, we'll go into that, but let's first hear Bart's side, and then I'll give my commentary after that. So, tune in.
If it's so important, then how did high cholesterol become associated with heart disease?
Right. So what happened was there was a very, very dishonest, basically I will refer to him as a criminal, who was in the science fraternity at the time by the name of Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys actually wasn't even a nutritionist. He was a fish physiologist. A lot of people don't know that. His area of research was the physiology of fish. He was kind of stuck for ideas. In academia, you need to publish or you don't get continued. You need to come up with something. He had this idea around saturated fat and its relationship, he thought, that he would find to heart disease. So what he did is he collected data from 21 or 22 countries in terms of people's chronic intakes of saturated fat, and he correlated that, or did a coincidence study that I was talking about earlier, with heart disease. And unfortunately, his hypothesis was not supported by his data from his 21 countries or so. He started out with a hypothesis saying, I believe the intake of saturated fat will be associated with heart disease. He did the study, 21 countries, hundreds of thousands of respondents, a huge sample size. Sorry, it didn't work out. So what he did was he rejected the data from all but 7 countries, and he cherry-picked the data from the 7 countries that did match his hypothesis. Basically, it's academic misconduct of the highest order. It's criminal. He lived to, I think, 100 and something, and he was lauded as, the most famous and influential clinician of his time, and he was thought of as a great bloke. Actually, he was a criminal that should have spent the last part of his life in prison, in my humble opinion. There you go. That's not how the universe works. And then from there, he said, okay, here's some data that suggests that eating saturated fat is associated with heart disease. Now we need a mechanism. So then scientists started looking into that. Obviously, they couldn't find one at all with saturated fat because there isn't one. There's no reason to believe.
All right, there you have it. That's Bart's view. Let's see how much of it correlates with the actual research. But first, when you hear Kait ask about the origin of this association between dietary fat and heart disease, the first thing Bart does, of utmost importance, is to attack Ancel Keys personally before addressing the actual topic. And he does that, and he does it repeatedly. Be leery about people who repeat themselves, especially when he makes statements such as Ancel was very, very dishonest. That hasn't been established, uh, not in the scientific literature. And when people say very, very, they're probably exaggerating. Not always, but in this case, most definitely. And then he refers to Ancel Keys as a criminal. Well, if you look at this paper I've got here that I introduced, Pett as well as others, in 2017, we find that in Finland, where at the time of the 6-country study, they had the highest saturated fat intake, but throughout as the results came about for the 7-country study, they ended up modifying their diet. The whole country did kind of an overhaul in their diets, and on average, that is. and they reduced their serum cholesterol by 20%. Pretty dramatic for a whole country to do that as a result, direct result of the 7-country study. And heart disease went down, life expectancy went up. And so this doesn't sound like criminal activity to me. You can attribute that to Ancel Keys. Like I said, this study has some truth bombs throughout. And here, right in the first paragraph, there is mention of the conspiracy, which it's referred to as the Ancel Keys himself, and the 7-country study is referred to as a conspiracy. It speaks of the popular press books and the blogs that come out to promote these myths that it's based on, and that these stem from a couple things, and that is the prevailing views of nutritional epidemiology in general. People who don't like epidemiology are very threatened by this. Like I said, this was the first study of its kind, and it was also people. It's important to keep in mind that this 7-country study was not unique in terms of what they found, because it was seminal research at the time. But since then, since the results have come out, many other independent researchers have found similar associations. But Ancel Keys is being targeted as though he just has pulled the wool over everybody's eyes. But we'll see throughout, looking at the evidence, that it's just not simple. It's just not the case. Every paragraph here is interesting. It goes over the main myths and how that you find about Ancel Keys in 7-country study, and how they are all false. Here is a graph of the 6-country study, and you can compare it with the 22-country study. Here's the data for the 22-country study. Look at the curve. I mean, if you did a best fitted line through this 22-country study, it would be pretty close to this 6-country study line. So all this fuss, and by the way, it's different data, and you would get similar results. But and by the way, we're looking at fat in the original 6-country study by Ancel Keys, 1953. It was published. Fat calories as percentage of total calories were calculated, so that's it. It wasn't saturated fat. That was not the original hypothesis. That was something that was found later in the 7-country study. The original hypothesis was to find the association between fat intake and heart disease deaths. Well, what are we missing out of this study? What's all this? Because we hear over and over that Ancel Keys cherry-picked the data, and it's usually referred to for the 7-country study, which doesn't even make sense, because that was separate data. It had nothing to do with this. Separate researchers, as I said. But if you go to the 6-country studies, if that's what people are referring to as far as the cherry-picked data, which oftentimes they do mix those together, I don't know what Bart's referring to. He's not talking about the 7-country study. Maybe he's confusing with the 22-country study and the 6-country study. But look, go through and carefully look at the actual data from each of the studies, and look at the evaluations of them. And what are we missing here? Well, we're missing a couple outliers we see right away. Here they are on the moderately, well, not really, but France is down here. Is it number 3, 5, something like that? I don't know the number. This is 8. Yeah, it's blurry here, but this is where France is. I remember it's because just below 30% of their dietary macronutrient intake was fat at the time, which is much less than the U.S., by the way. And there's this thing called the French paradox, where you probably all heard about it, where French eat this cuisine that's very high in fat and lots of red wine. They do drink lots of red wine, so does America, but no, their dietary fat intake has not until like 1985 did it catch up with what United States average dietary fat intake was. So and there was something called we'll get into it, the lag in the time that it took for the results of the high fat diet to come into effect. It never really did hit like it did with America, but this French paradox thing had been blown out of proportion. So here's France down here, less than 30% of the dietary fat. So yeah, France got taken out of the 6-country study. That was one. You can see, and people got all upset. Well, that's not really going to help your data much. But it is a little bit of an outlier. And then Mexico, a big outlier, because they're real low in the death rates, considering even though the dietary fat intake wasn't that high, they're so low. I mean, they were the lowest in the heart disease death. Well, they didn't have a formal death certificate program in place until the 1950 or in the 1950s, sometime in the 1950s, and even in the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they had not completed the death certification. So that was not reliable data. So that's why they're taken out, and that's why this is skewed. You see, it's an outlier. That's why Ancel Keys didn't include that data. You have Finland up here, number 7. They were excluded, and yes, they have high-fat diets. So you might say, well, what about them? Well, they were excluded because of the German Nazi occupation of areas of Finland, preventing them from having their normal diet. But Bart would have you include these sources with unreliable data, and so would the other high-fat diet gurus who are railing against Ancel Keys, because he's excluded poor, unreliable data. And if you think it's difficult to get reliable data now in epidemiological studies, it was much more so at the time, where statistics weren't kept like they are now. Other countries, Norway, Denmark, I think Sweden, not sure about Sweden actually, Norway and Denmark, the Netherlands, yeah, they also had Nazi occupation, and so they were excluded because they were impacted by the Nazi occupation, and their diet was impacted as such. So it wasn't reliable data to include in the 6-country study, so they were excluded. But it's a lot of fuss about a graph that it's just a little sharper incline than it would be if you did a best fitted line right through the 22-country study anyway. Sure, you've got a wider distribution, you've got more countries, so you expect that. So a lot of fuss, but we'll find out. There's even more interesting tidbits that we'll go into later with that. Also, France was actually invited to join the 7-country study because Ancel took in his own data, recorded his own data. He didn't rely on national mortality data or national diet data for that. He took his own. They were invited. Representative scientists from France participated in the 1957 7-country study, dress rehearsal in Nicotera, Italy, where researchers met to standardize protocols before the start of the formal 7-country study, and which was after the 22-country study was already finished. But France ultimately did not provide cohorts for the 7-country study, so there you go. So, for different reasons, not that it was cherry-picked, Ancel Keys did not include all 22 countries. And this paper goes through some of those reasons, and also talks about, some people say, well, what about just sugar content? Sugar is associated with heart disease. Yes, but not as much. Anyway, you can check that study out yourself. Let me go on. This is just about the Dutch famine in the Netherlands from 1945 to winter of 1944 to winter of 1945. Yeah, the famous Dutch famine. So you can't include that data. That's not represented. There are still people, this study goes to show, still people to this day suffering from the effects of the Dutch famine. So why would you include that data? Alright, so Hembert in early 1971 showed examples of many death certificates ascribed to cardiosclerose. Okay, so this is France. Then cardiosclerose refers to, it's a generic wastebasket label for cardiac death not meeting the French criteria for myocardial infarction, and not then coded to the ischemic rubrics of the International Vital Statistics of the World Health Organization. So this actually accounted for potentially up to 20% of the variation in the death by heart disease results. This is from University of Minnesota. Other interesting factoids in here. If you look at it, it talks more about the French paradox and the time lag to hypothesis that explains how the French diet was not originally such a high-fat diet, and it's been exaggerated and romanticized as being such, but that there was a small window of time that it applied the French paradox because of the high-fat diet. It also goes into talking about how you have a north to south gradient in France of high fat intake and heart disease association, and that contiguous countries at the same latitude as France also have this. So within the countries, you have this association of dietary fat and death by heart disease, as well as across countries, but more within the countries, as it turns out. And this goes into talking about the time lag explanation. You see, I'm just posting the references again. Don't listen to me or any one person, but go through and check the references yourself, check the research, use critical thinking. This is a nutritionist in America talking about the French paradox, just what I've described. This, again, talks about in the 1950s that Mexico had not yet developed a death certificate system, and even in the 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, what was it, 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, yeah, mortality data was only 70 or 80% complete anyway. So, by that time, the 7-country study was well on their way. Just something to show that people didn't really listen to Ancel Keys anyway, right? That Americans, they're still, look how they're not eating the recommended fruits and vegetables. They're still eating much more than the recommended saturated fat levels. And dietary fat has continued to go up, despite Ancel Keys' words. And it's going up the same rate as carbohydrates, approximately. Here's another graph. This is loss adjusted, so if the meat's spoiled, this kind of takes into account estimating for that, etc. But they're similar. Everything's gone up. People eating more protein, eating more carbs, eating more fat. This is Yerushalmi and Hillebo. Those are the ones that kind of were the first two researchers or statisticians who challenged Ancel Keys in some of the matters that when he published his 6-country study. You can pull this up. This is a 1957 article. I don't think you even need a scientific database. You can go on I think I got this from Google Scholar, but here's the title. Here it is. Fat in the diets and mortality from heart disease and methodological notes. And so they go through and they talk about, there's a 6-country study there. They talk about the difference between correlation and causation. Here's data from the 22-country study. And then look, when we get down here, they make this finding because they're speaking out against Ancel Keys, maybe putting too much stock in the association as a causation kind of thing. But what they do find, instead of fat calories being associated with deaths from heart disease, they showed a stronger correlation with animal protein calories and death by heart disease. So, what are the actual findings of the Yerushalmi and Hillebo 22-country studies? That's something you don't hear a lot about. A lot of fuss about, oh, well, they cherry-picked it. Well, here you go. This is the one that includes 22-country study, all 22 countries, so there you go. Again, it's poor data anyway, but they were onto something. In this study, Meany as well as others, or maybe just Meany in 2018, Meany, yeah, as well as others, a lot of other authors in this. This is an informative study. They go through here on page 180 I was looking at. I mean, again, this is packed with information, and it's pretty easy reading. LDL, so physiological LDL cholesterol serum concentration of human beings is 70 milligrams per deciliter, in the vicinity of the figure of 50 milligrams per deciliter, according with our ape forage eater lineage. What does that mean? It means that when people are born, when humans are born, they have low LDL cholesterol, serum LDL cholesterol levels. And it does, I think it's between 40 and 60 or something like that. And chimps do too. They have comparable levels. Chimps remain pretty low. They go up a little bit as they develop, but they stay much lower than humans, where humans goes much higher, and humans have much more heart disease. Well, if people keep their cholesterol very low, as in that's what physiological levels are alluding to or describe, then they maintain that low risk of heart disease. But society's idea of low, or the standards, are just between 70 and 100, which is really not that low when you look at comparative anatomy. What's wrong? Why not look at comparative anatomy? I don't think people are looking at this often enough. These are the ones that are shown in human studies to be the safe levels too. So below 70 would be ideal, actually. Here's an Ancel Keys 1953 study showing you the title. You can get this online too. It's fun to just kind of look at the 1953 paper by Ancel Keys, look at the 1957 one by Yershami and Hilbo, and then go read like Wikipedia, and you might just end up feeling kind of sorry. You can hear, because Wikipedia, they used to say that Ancel Keys cherry-picked the data from the 22-country study too, which is totally false, completely made up. But it's one of those things where one person says it, the other person hears it and repeats it, and the story just keeps going on in spite of the literature that contrasts to that. So you can go and look at the papers, and then go read Wikipedia, and just see how humorous it is. Anybody can do that. So right above the conclusions, we see from Ancel Keys himself. Okay, this is 1953, after the 6-country study. From the statistics of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, it is clear that the biggest contributor to fats in the American diet is fats and oils as such, excluding butter, which comprises 46.5% of the total dietary intake of macronutrients. That was, or for fat rather, that was back in 1953. Meats, poultry, and fish combined make up for second at only 22.1%. Making up with 22.1% of the dietary fat. Any attempt to reduce the total fat intake must then begin with cooking fats and oils. He's talking about excluding plant-based fats. He's specifically saying keep your animal fat in there. Take out, begin with taking out the plant fat. So Ancel Keys wasn't a vegan. Most researchers aren't vegan. It's not a conspiracy. Most researchers consume meat, so it's not a big conspiracy. You've seen that. You'll see it over and over. It gets confused though. Here's something that the study is showing. Still, it's ongoing. Go to the website, as I said, check it out yourself. Every additional amount of 10 grams per day of recently consumed fiber was associated with significant 17% lower risk of fatal coronary heart disease. This is just one of the bits of information, one of the nuggets you'll find if you just click on these links. It'll tell you all about the study and all about, it's ongoing. It'll tell you about what else they're finding as the study goes on. It wasn't based on hundreds of thousands of people, but originally about 12,000 people. Of course, some of them died off by now, but the 7-country studies was not based on hundreds of thousands of people. Not for the data they used to get the association with the dietary fats and coronary heart disease, death by coronary heart disease. Now, one thing that is true, and that is that the 7-country study, not the 6-country study, not the 22-country study, but the 7-country study did not show a significant association between dietary fat and death by coronary heart disease. So that is what that's the main point Bart's making, and that is actually correct. The main point Bart makes is correct. All the other stuff, though, is some twisting to make it seem like Ancel intentionally manipulated the data. That's just mere speculation and just personal attacks. There's no evidence of that at all. In fact, there's only evidence to show that he was trying to be very critical, exercising scientific discrimination in filtering out those unreliable sources. All right, so check out this information and use critical thinking. And thank you for watching